This is Speaking of Shakespeare, conversations about things Shakespearean. I'm Thomas Stabbs, broadcasting from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. This is a non-commercial broadcast, so we've shied away from asking viewers to subscribe or follow us. But having subscribers, which is free, helps us to gain support from grant agencies and to continue this series. So if you like us, please tap or click the red subscribe button on YouTube on the lower right-hand side of your screen or the follow button on your podcast. This talk is with Tanya Pollard, professor of English at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York. Tanya writes on many subjects, including the history of bodies, emotions, science, medicine, sexuality, gender, actors, performance, and historical responses to Greek theater. We will talk about her work, beginning with her recent edition of The Alchemist by Ben Jonson. This talk is made possible with support from the Aoyama Gakuin Institute of the Humanities. Tanya, you contain multitudes. First off, you have worked on Greek influences in Shakespearean drama, and you are currently looking into the lack of feminine heroes in the Shakespearean period. We will get to this in a bit, but for now, you've recently produced an edition for the Arden series on Ben Jonson's play, The Alchemist. We see Jonson now as a Shakespearean contemporary, maybe below or behind, but not Shakespeare. But there's a good argument out there that in Shakespeare's time, if one were to ask who the top playwright was, then the answer would be Jonson. He was a satirist, deeply involved with city life in London, and difficult for us now because of the classical elements that you know so well, that he mixes with contemporaneous and often vulgar and inside jokes that are sometimes hard for us to get. But The Alchemist is indeed brilliant, along with other plays of his. May we ask you to tell us about the challenges of editing Jonson before we move on to your other work?
I would be thrilled. And first of all, I just want to go on the record. First of all, thank you for that lovely introduction. And second of all, I want to go on the record as saying I am a huge fan of Ben Jonson. And I see it as one of my missions in life to go forth and sing the good news of Jonson to people who haven't discovered him and to people who see Jonson as old-fashioned, cranky, conservative, and a snob. It's not that he's not cranky. It's not that he's not a snob, but Jonson has this fun-loving streak. And Jonson's plays, this I think is the mystery that a lot of people have kept concealed. Some people tell me in the theater world, oh, well, but they're just literary. They don't stage. Jonson stages so well. And I have been lucky enough to see a lot of terrific productions of Alchemist as well as of other Jonson plays. But it is hell to edit. I will say The Alchemist was a lot of work. I wish that I could say I handled it with talent and aplomb. No, I think I was a pretty inexperienced and inept editor, frankly. I'm just deeply grateful. Gordon McMullen was my supervising editor, and he put in his time. He put in his hours training me to come to grips with it. But there were also problems that weren't my problems that were really Ben Jonson's challenges to Arden, because the Arden early modern drama editions, like the Arden Shakespeare editions, want a modern English version. And so that things should be put in standard convention. And Jonson makes that really hard because he's very particular. At least I believe that Jonson had a very active role in editing for print. That's not something we necessarily assume of all early playwrights, but Jonson seems to have been pretty proprietary. And one of the things that struck me with editing Alchemist, just at the very first beginning level of modernizing, sort of standardizing the text, is how crowded his sentences are with contractions, elisions, apostrophes, where they don't need to be. Every line essentially has at least one or two contractions. And I found it baffling. And we had endless debates. Do we translate this into modern English spelling? Sometimes that's going to change the meter. Even when it doesn't change the meter, sometimes that's eliding something that I think is important to Jonson, which is showing what a rush his characters are in, showing how crowded the page is, showing the pressure that everyone in this alchemical lab is under. And one of the just fundamental nuts and bolts challenges was figuring out how to handle at a very logistical level the crowdedness of his strings of words in ways that could be compatible with Arden's conventions, but still capture something of the breathless Russian fury and hustle of these sentences in which every word is missing letters and every word needs to have kind of contractions just to show that the characters can't rush through it quickly enough. That's just one of the challenges. And the other more content challenge is there's just so much to gloss. I think I was asked to do this edition primarily because I had a background in science, because my first book was on drugs and theater.
Mhm.
And without entirely intending to, I developed a pretty considerable body of knowledge about early modern medicine and pharmacy and science. So the alchemical language was really fascinating to me, and it's astonishingly accurate. Every word that's there is there for a reason, and it works on an alchemical level as well as theatrically. But there's a lot of alchemical glossing, and then there's just you find yourself falling down these rabbit holes of London's early London sewer system, or crises in early puritanical sects and how Jonson reveals them in a series of veiled illusions, series of early modern European coins that need glossing and defining. There was just so many barrels of research. You could never say, okay, I'm going to become an expert in alchemy and I'm all set. No, you had to become an expert in just well, I had to become a very superficial expert in a lot of different topics. So it was a lot of time. It took me a lot more of my life than I had recognized when I unwittingly signed on to it. But it
Uh,
was so much
it's,
fun.
it's,
It's
uh, it, it,
such a
it's,
fun
I
topic.
can't imagine. I can't imagine doing it. It's so different from Shakespeare. In so far, well, let's start with the city. And the Shakespeare stayed away from the city. I think that was dangerous turf. You could get in trouble very quickly. Johnson plunged right into it. And then, if you would imagine, what, 400 years from now, someone trying to give us the meaning of a popular rap song, right?
Right.
That
Right.
also that also hails back to some, I don't know, Beethoven or some sort of classical influence. Those
Exactly.
things crunch together, and you're having to do this. And I could think of hundreds of examples now would be obscure for us even now if we're not up on it. And that's what the challenge is. And but these characters, I remember Sir Epicure Mammon. It
He's
just
my
makes
favorite.
I mean, just the name.
Mammon is just so spectacularly blissful in his self-indulgence, the euphoria of his fantasies. I find them completely irresistible. I just love Mammon. And I love in productions that I've seen when you have a Mammon who really enjoys being Mammon, it's so satisfying. You feel we all get to live vicariously through that exuberant, unself-conscious, all out capitulation to pleasure. It's wonderful. And I have to say, I really believe that Jonson loves him too. People like to say, oh, Jonson, he's so snide and he's making fun of all these people, and he is making fun of them, but I think he really enjoys the verve that someone like Mammon brings to the page. And I think he really pursues it more than he has to. Um,
Yeah, there's a kind of the word fellowship is a little on the masculine side, but there is this sort of
yeah,
fellowship in what taking the piss out of people. And
I agree.
and everybody, if they don't know the person, they know the type. They know a Sir Epicure Mammon somewhere around. They've seen him. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
Uh,
we know Johnson liked to drink. Johnson liked to eat. Johnson, I don't know if I could safely say he liked women, but he had some interest in the pleasures of the flesh. And I think that we can sort of see that. He's not only a kind of cranky critic. He seems to be really enjoying the exuberance that we
Yeah.
get there.
And he goes easy on these characters. Now, they do some
Uh,
kind of terrible things, and he goes very easy on them in the end.
Absolutely. They only get wrapped mildly on the knuckles. I mean, the alchemists themselves, they don't get to keep the money, but they don't go to jail. They don't get tortured. It's not like Volpone where they're going to be, locked away in chains. He's lets them all off with a pat on the back. They sort of climb over the back fence and the gulls kind of go home without their money and without their mysterious philosopher's stone. But they've had a good time. There's no harm that seems to have come out of it. Face gets to keep his job and he gets to up his standing in his employers.
He
Um,
finds a wife, right? He finds a
well,
wife for
Face doesn't get the wife. That's right, but he gives love with the wife, and so
love with
he's
the wife, and
engaged
love
there.
with is sort of co-opted at that point. You would think there'd be somebody, and an honest dealer in the play. No.
There's no moral, zero moral. No, there is. I think the moral of the story is that at the end of the day, it is better to be rich than not to be rich. Because the winner is the person with the house. And the moral is it's better to have a house than not to have a house. That is what I think Jonson is telling us. And I think, Jonson is living in this very urban, as you say, world. And I live in New York City. I know that real estate matters. Jonson knows that real estate matters. He's not really looking to see who is going to win by being virtuous or not. He is going to see who is going to win by being savvy about their real estate arrangements. And, the con artists do a pretty good job for a while of figuring out, okay, we've got this real estate for a period of time. Let's get out of it what we can while we're here. Turns out not to be enough time. They lose. The guy who owns the house is always going to be the winner. This is what they say in casinos, right? The house always wins. I mean, that to me seems to be the story of the alchemist. The house always wins. Um, but yeah, there seems to be a lot of enjoyment of that. And in the epilogue, we get told, yeah, come back, we'll feast you again, which is to say the house is still here. There's still money because we've got you suckers buying tickets. So there's something festive, I think, about that.
Oh yeah, I think that The Alchemist is arguably the most performed, maybe, of Johnson's plays
I
historically.
think Volpone. I think
Volpone,
Volpone is a
okay,
little bit more, but Alchemist is pretty close.
but
Yeah,
those would be the two, right? Volpone
that's
and
right.
uh,
Yeah,
The Alchemist. It's a
right.
shame. We know kind of famously that the first folio of a dramatic work was Johnson's, and I
Right.
think that was 1616, that before the 1623 production of the now very very famous Shakespeare folio. But it was Jonson who was the trailblazer on that
Absolutely.
this drama could be something that was folio worthy, you know
Mhm.
and uh and there's so much else there. And so let's see.
Just say, add to that. I also think Johnson saw that there could be money in the printed text, which doesn't seem to have been something that Shakespeare
Mhm.
saw. The King's Men owned the plays, the King's Men handled the edition later. Johnson didn't have the shareholding advantages that Shakespeare did, so he didn't have that economic edge. And for Johnson, I think he's thinking, what can I sell? If people are going to give me money for this, let me make it a big one. Let me make it a big package that I can get more money. And I think Johnson is very interested in money. And that's part of what is so fascinating about Alchemist. There's a lot of counting of the coins, a lot of counting of the money. And as you say, those of us who live in urban settings can kind of feel the resonance of his very urban sensibility, even though there's so much in his references and allusions that has aged out beyond comprehensibility. I think we can still recognize the pressure of like, we need a house, we need some money. And I think Johnson's folio instincts seem to me to be in line both with like, I need a monument for myself. I can't count on anyone else to do that. But also like maybe I can make a few bucks here, you know.
Yeah, yeah. That's it. And that's where you go. Someone like you, that's where you go. You're drawn to it because of the classical influences, because that's your base. That's the foundation of your scholarship, looking for those particularly Hellenic, Grecian influences in the drama of this period. And so I want to transition now. We can come back, but I'd like to
Yeah.
transition because I'm interested in what you're doing. And I want to also make sure that people remember that you put out the award-winning book, Greek Tragic Women on the Shakespearean Stage. And you have not, you're taking that forward, it sounds like. And so tell us well, explain to us. Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much. I'm not sure I would say that the classical backdrop is my base. I think the theater is my base, and I do love Greek plays for the same reasons that I love the plays from this period. This book, Greek Tragic Women, it wasn't my first book, but it was my plan. It was my original plan for my dissertation. I applied to grad school to research links between Greek tragedy and early modern theater. And universally, everybody told me, you can't do that. And some people were pretty sniffy about it. One academic who will go unnamed said to me, well, we're a very progressive department. We're very forward looking. You're interested in classics. You're interested in the Greeks. That's very old fashioned. That's very conservative. I don't know if you would feel comfortable here. So which I was kind of astonished by because it had never occurred to me that there was anything conservative about Euripides. But I was told so repeatedly, this is not a possible research project that I thought, all right, fine, I'll do something else. But in my mind, it still seems something that should be done. And I'm pretty stubborn. So after I published a first book and I had tenure, then I thought, yeah, I'm coming back to this.
Hmm.
And where it ended up going was completely different than what I had expected. And that's the romance of research. That was what was thrilling. All I wanted to do was to show that people in early modern England were aware of the were aware of the Greek dramatic tradition, and were thinking about it as they created their own theatrical tradition. That was my goal. So I started really at a very basic archival level, looking for additions, looking for text, looking for transmission. And I will say that, there's been some wonderful work on this. Emrys Jones wrote a very influential book on the origins of Shakespeare. Louise Schleiner had a great article. And it was really Laurie McGuire who I had a conversation with at an early stage in this. And she had a great chapter on Greek tragedy in her book on Shakespeare's names. She said, go look for the editions. Look at what they're getting access to in this period. So I started going through editions and writing them down and photographing them and taking notes. And I started to note this really strange pattern, which is the plays that are appearing time after time after time in English libraries and continental libraries in 16th century editions, 16th century Latin translations, 16th century vernacular translations. They were all plays about women, and they were almost all plays about Hecuba and Iphigenia and Alice. And this was strange. This was not something I was expecting to find. It was not something I was looking for. And there was one day when I was looking down a list that I had made of Hecuba, 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 Hecuba. And being a Shakespearean, I found myself thinking, what's Hecuba to him or he to Hecuba? And thinking there's something here. And I think that it's my theory now that the reason so many generations and really literally, I would say hundreds of years of scholars have insisted there's no link between Greek drama and the early modern English stage is that I think scholars for hundreds of years, for a long, long time in Shakespeare studies, scholars were mostly looking for Aeschylus' Agamemnon, Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. They were looking for their idea of tragedy, which was male. And a lot of early generations of scholars were men, and they were looking for what they recognized as the origins of tragedy. And that was not what 16th century writers recognized as the origin of tragedy. So if you go to this period and you look for references and allusions to Oedipus, to the Bacchae, to Agamemnon, you don't really find them very much because that's not what they were talking about. But if you look instead to see what was there, you see there was a lot. And it was a lot of plays about women. And so that book ended up becoming something completely different than what I had anticipated. I did manage to talk about lines of transmission from Greek tragedy into early modern England. And originally it was going to be tragedy and comedy and satire. It sort of narrowed down because it got so big.
Mm.
Um, but I found it became a book about gender and a book about ideas of tragedy changing, and specifically the idea that 16th century writers really identified this very prestigious genre. Tragedy originated in the ancient Greek world, really identified it with female passion, especially with maternal passion, and gave that a kind of gravitas and a kind of prestige value that is very different than I would say our modern associations about 16th century and 17th century tragedy have ended up being. And so that became the question that I came away from that book with is why did the early modern English read plays, read tragedies about women, and write tragedies about men? And obviously that's a simplification because obviously Shakespeare has some very powerful female tragic figures, Cleopatra, Lady Macbeth, Juliet. And of course, there are other tragedies, the Duchess of Malfi. There are other female figures on the English tragic stage. But by and large, if you just do a quick kind of name check statistical study, the plays by Shakespeare that are categorized as tragedies almost exclusively titled for male protagonists versus the plays that are titled, the Greek plays that were really widely published, translated, performed in this time, almost entirely titled for female protagonists. And this has become a question now that's really fascinating me. And that's where I'm going. So I'm actually now moving away from the Greek side and more into thinking what was happening in England that changed this agenda.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's the Jonson line about Shakespeare, the what small Latin, less Greek. And I think that was the resistance that you felt maybe in graduate school. You were at Yale.
That's right.
And so, and if I'm cross-referencing, I would see how they would be moving away from that. I think there might have been a feeling out there that Shakespeare didn't know, and other dramatists. But what we know very clearly now, because we have all this stuff now, we have a lot of stuff has been digitized, and we can bring it up very quickly. Is that a lot of this stuff was in translation? You know, you didn't have to be fluent in Greek to understand the structure of Greek drama or Latin. So there's that, but that doesn't answer the question of why wouldn't you carry forward. I've seen some evidence in the early Elizabethan period for perhaps court dramas where
Mhm.
they went to the Amazon when
Yes.
for the Protestants when Mary was queen before Elizabeth. Amazon, she was an Amazon, and that was bad. When Elizabeth became
Right.
queen, she was an Amazon, and that was good.
That was good.
Yeah,
Right.
it just completely pivoted on that, and the same writers. And
Yeah.
I think it might have been Knox. But anyhow, but that did not take that. I'm thinking early Elizabethan play. Now she's a younger queen, and
Mhm.
they are celebrating her, I guess, youth and the prospect of her marriage, and well, of course, they know what side their bread's buttered on. Uh,
Of course. Right.
could it be at one point the queen gets older and she doesn't? Let's kill some men on stage. I don't know, uh, but these, of course, are public dramas too. You have to attract the public. But in our view now, the play should just be Cleopatra, right? That's the play,
I think,
and
yeah.
you could say Juliet and Romeo. because in my teaching it over the years, she's a far superior poet. And I think it was purposeful on Shakespeare's part. And she's just like she's more advanced. She's more accustomed to thinking about these things. And Romeo just seems to be a little bit befuddled throughout. He gets better after he kills somebody. He gets really good, I think. But uh,
Helps. Mhm.
he needed that experience, I guess. So, yeah, what do you attribute it? Oh, and the final thing is, I'm throwing stuff out here, see what sticks. But uh, the idea that the characters would have had that they had to be played by boys.
Mhm.
So not we are learning now exclusively, but
Mhm.
pretty much. So maybe that had something to do with it.
I think it did. And I think it's not that the boys couldn't play female roles well, because I think there were some spectacular boy actors, and we see that there are some spectacular female roles crafted for them. But my instinct does go to very much to the material circumstances of casting, and that's what I've been writing about recently. So one of the things that I do when I'm not teaching or writing about plays is I've been lucky enough, since I live in New York, to have the chance to work with a lot of local productions and spend a lot of time talking with directors and talking with actors. And one of the things that I've been struck by, and it would not be original to anyone who's spent a lot of time around actual theaters, is how much the play is made by the actors and by the directors, as well as by the other laborers, the people doing sets, the people doing costumes, and how much, just how self-conscious actors are about what they're bringing to the part, what the part means to them, what kind of chemistry they're creating between their own experience, their own emotional response, and what they're finding in the language. And I think spending the amount of time that I spend essentially with actors made me think more about Shakespeare's position as a writer for a repertory company. And of course, there's been a lot of wonderful work in theater history. Lucy Monroe is one of my oldest friends in Shakespeare studies. We met when I was in grad school and spent a year in London. So I see Shakespeare studies very much through Lucy's lens of theater history. But of course, Tiffany Stern, who you've had on this show, um, Bart Van Es has done some wonderful work about Shakespeare and Company. But so I started thinking more about what does it mean to be writing for a group of actors, 10 of whom roughly at different points, there are different numbers, are shareholding members, which means they're economically invested in this spectacle. And then you have these apprentices, and the apprentices don't have the same relationship to the final product. They don't have as many years of training. They don't have an economic foothold. They don't have the same direct kind of investment. And depending on the stage they are in their training, they're going to be getting more or less um, amount of scope with their lines. And one of the things that I've been struck by, I've just written a comparative piece looking at how tragedy develops differently in continental Europe from in England, is that continental Europe does not deviate from the Greek tragic female-centered model in the same way, because you start having actresses in Spain and actresses in Italy and actresses in France, and very quickly, when professional actresses come on the stage, they become the kind of magnetic center of audiences' attention. People want to see the actresses, and they want to see them show their legs. So plots start developing in ways that will show women running mad because they're more likely to take off clothing if they're mad, or women falling in love, which also makes them more likely to take off clothing. And I started to realize that you get a different set of plots written for an actress-centered theater than you do for an actor-centered theater, in which you get a lot of tragedies about the deaths of kings, or about men who become jealous of their wives and make a terrible mess of their lives. And one of the things that I've been looking at is the way that plot structure and genre structure follows casting options. So that in the ancient Greek world, the actors are still all male. It's not as if it's some feminist or matriarchal world, but the male actors who perform the parts in a Greek tragedy wear masks, and your most experienced actor can play Medea as easily as she can play Agamemnon, as easily as he can play Agamemnon, which means that there's no particular financial or professional reason to prioritize male roles for your actors rather than female roles. But if you need to have roles for Hemmings and Burbage and Kemp and Condell, you need to have some pretty meaty male roles for them. You're not going to put them on the sidelines and let your apprentice run away with the show. At least that is my reading. I'm not going to say this is the only reason why I think tragedy evolves differently in England than in the ancient Greek world or Renaissance Italy, Renaissance Spain, Renaissance France. But from my current actor-centric mode, I would say I think this is really important. And I think many of us in the field still have a tendency to see Shakespeare as a literary writer more than just as a person of the theater. And even when we understand, as so many theater historians are doing just incredible work on helping us understand what it means that these plays are written for the theater, in the theater, by the theater, of the theater. I think there's still more to say about the ways that the actors you write for shape plots, shape characters, and shape genres and shape trends. I think the literary trends come very much from the actors. So that's kind of what I'm interested in right now. And the great thing is that's very compatible with spending a lot of time at productions and talking to actors and talking to playwrights. It's also really interesting to talk to playwrights who are writing now about their relationship with the actors that they write for. And some playwrights are very much aware that they write a role with a particular actor in mind. One playwright I know told me that her plays started changing after an actress she wrote for went through an accident and became disabled. She didn't stop writing for her, but she started writing different characters. I
Hmm.
thought that was the characters had different constraints in what they could do. And I found that fascinating. So I love hearing from playwrights about the roles that actors do or don't play in their imagination, in how they're thinking about what kinds of stories they would like to play. I think that's an underestimated um, factor in the theatrical landscape. It's something I'm really interested in. And I won't say I'm an expert. There are a lot of theater historians who are much more versed than I am in Shakespeare's actors, but this is something that right now I'm really excited to learn more about.
Hmm. Yeah, so yes, there probably was some garden variety sexism. Of course there was, right?
Of course.
But you're looking
Still
at I guess what we'd call the material base,
right.
the immediate needs of the theater, this active daily ticket selling, and these actors who are shareholders who need their big roles, the Burbages or whatnot, and people, they become popular and their name draws in, just like in
Yeah.
modern movies. You go to see the movie sometimes because Denzel Washington's in it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
And
That's
so,
exactly the parallel that I would use. Absolutely. Would say, oh, that's a Tom Cruise vehicle. Oh, that's a Brad Pitt vehicle.
mm,
Oh, that's a Denzel Washington picture. I think that is more true, maybe, than we recognize in this period. Clearly in Italy, we know that people were going to see a particular actress, and there were big, passionate fights about which actress's team you're on, kind of like European soccer team allegiances,
yeah.
which team are you rooting for? And I think there's some of that going in England too, in a different way. And I think that's really factoring in the kinds of imaginations, the kinds of stories people are telling. Clearly, again, there are clearly spectacular boy actors. And the court masks, as you point out, that's a whole different population. And court masks can and sometimes are very female centric because they have access to a whole different set of actors. And the boys' companies, which Lucy Monroe has written so much about, they have access all because all of their actors are younger and can play female parts. They often have more female-centered plots than the adult male companies, and that is something I'm really interested in.
Well, these continental the productions that you're looking into, would they actually have had women playing the roles in the continental productions as opposed? So what I'm thinking, and this is a rough draft, is one thing about this explosion of drama that we see just before Shakespeare, during Shakespeare, and after, before the until the theaters were closed, is that there's an extraordinarily large boom in public attendance in the city, but around too in the provinces. That I've talked to several people on this series that we don't see it on the continent. It's still a little bit more of the elite class in Spain and France, and that might be the abeyance to classical, the more obvious, something like that. I don't think that they had this town that had these theaters that were filling up every day, really, uh, with John Q. Public. Uh,
It does happen in Spain. I would say Spain is the closest parallel, and it may be slightly later. It's also not as unipolar as in England. It's all sort of centered in London. In Spain, there are more capitals, there are more locations where theater is happening. And that's true in Italy as well. It's more diffuse, so it's a little harder to track.
hmm.
But theater going becomes a very popular commercial based project in Spain as well, and to a slightly lesser extent in Italy. It's not quite the same as England. I agree with you, and I think there are a lot of reasons for that. But I think celebrity culture um, becomes an enormous selling point in Spain as well as in Italy, as well as in England, when people start getting attached to certain stars, just as we do. We see that someone's new film comes out and we think, oh, I want to see what they're doing now. I think that also happened in early modern theaters.
That's absolutely fascinating stuff. I could talk with you about this all day. There's so much material out there that it's hard to be certain. This is hard writing, and I feel your pain because I'm doing this kind of stuff too. Every sentence, it seems like you have to go through a hundred different things to check what you're saying and make sure that you're not just, that somebody isn't going to come out and say, listen, that's completely wrong or whatever. But, you know, that's what exploration is. I mean, if it weren't like that, then it's already been done.
The beautiful thing is that when you have tenure, you have freedom to play. Now, I'm not saying that I want to go out and just, write any old thing down. I get things vetted. My best security in life is that I make Lucy Monroe read pretty much everything I write, and she won't let me, I can't say she can't completely save me from being a little crazy at times, but and I have other friends who read things and keep me a little bit more disciplined. So I can say, here are things we know, here are questions we can ask, here are things we can speculate about that we don't know, but that raise some interesting questions about other kinds of research that might be useful to know more of. And I think that's a good thing. And I don't want to model irresponsible speculation. I don't want to shift from this could happen to like, this is certainly what happened. But I think you never know what we might find. I think it doesn't hurt to ask the questions.
No, it surely does not. What I would like to comment on is that what you just said, this is something that I'm hearing more and more of, and it's good, and it is pre-peer review and not collaborating exactly, but
Yeah.
all of us helping each other. Uh,
Yes.
so that we don't get to the point of publication and get that jerk who comes back and with a bad review or says, no, I won't publish it, whatever. We joke about this all the time, in our little circles, but the, that
I agree with you so much. I
yeah.
think I'm writing very much on the theater as a space of collaborative creativity. Shakespeare has to work with Hemmings and with Condell and with Burbage and with the apprentices. And I am writing that from a perspective of I am working with collaborators for creative projects. I love sharing work and swapping work with friends. And I wouldn't dare put something out without getting some viewpoints, some responses, some bouncing back and forth. It just wouldn't be better. I know that I'm not omniscient, and I'm sure I still make plenty of mistakes, but it's just more fun to be able to, it's more fun and more satisfying, and I think it gets you further if you can really engage.
Yeah,
Um,
and it can
with
get lonely. But this is a good segue here because we're talking about collaboration in a way, communicating with each other, helping each other out, that sort of thing. But what I love about your work is it seems very grounded in the realities of the stage, like you have talked about already. But I did want to go into actually what is your work with theaters. You're so fortunate there to be in New York. There's such a wonderful theater scene, and you're involved with it. This feeds into your research writing, but it's also another element of your life as a teacher, as a scholar, as a who you are. So explain some of that. Let us know what you're doing now, or maybe give us a bit of a history of that.
Sure. So I was very lucky. First of all, lucky because I happen to live in New York City, and that's where there are a lot of plays. And then there was one time, I don't even know if it was 10 years ago, it was a long time ago. I was at a production um, of a play by John Ford, and I ran into my Rich McCoy, who is my colleague, was my colleague at the Grad Center. He's now retired, who was there with Jim Shapiro. And we struck up a conversation at the interval. And the next day, Jim Shapiro emailed me and said, "Can I get your number and give you a call?" And I said, "Sure." And he gave me a call and said, "I'm trying to round up some people to be on a council of scholars for theater for new audience. Would you be interested?" Um, and that's the sort of thing where you're supposed to say, "Let me think about this, give me some information." I was just like, "Yes." I thought about it already. Okay, now tell me what I do. I was just so excited, and I tend to be a little reckless about things like that. I think if something just sounds really appealing to me, it's very hard for me to say, "I'm going to consider the pros and cons." So, and I had no idea what it would mean. And it has meant different things every year, but essentially, and I'm now chair of the Council for Scholars, which mostly means I write program notes. I do talkbacks for audiences, sometimes with actors, sometimes with directors, sometimes with other scholars, other people coming in. I have conversations with Jeffrey Horwitz, who's the theater's founding artistic director. I get to go to events. I talk to donors sometimes about you know, their interests, their questions about the plays. Basically, it just means I get to see a lot of plays and talk to a lot of creative types about making them. And I try never to miss an opening night. We get invited, the people on the council get invited to the opening nights. And because I'm here, I can usually go. And it's just a wonderful opportunity to talk to the cast and to talk to other people who are committed to the plays. I think I frankly get a lot more out of it than I give. I mean, I like to write program notes. I like to moderate talkbacks, but basically I just get to be around things a lot. And then I had a similar experience maybe around the same time with the Red Bull Theater. No, I chased that one down. I moved to New York um, 22 years ago, 2002, and 20 years ago, 2004, someone called Jesse Berger started up the Red Bull Theater. And at the time, I was newly in New York. I didn't have kids. I saw the posters. I went out and actually wrote Jesse and I was like, "Jesse, I live in New York. I write about these plays. I want to be involved. What can I do? What can I do?" And I basically just banged on his door until he said, "Okay, fine, I'll find something for you to do." He couldn't really get rid of me. So eventually I just ended up doing more and more things things for them. And so I also, for the Red Bull, often write program notes, often participate in their post-show talkbacks. I'm actually doing a panel discussion on next year's Shakespeare Association with Gene Howard and Jesse Berger and Noemi Ndiaye and a few other people talking about scholar-artist partnerships in the theater and talking about theatrical performance and production as a form of research, essentially. So it's become it was sort of accidental. It was just, I kept chasing things down. And in the case of Theater for New Audience, I had a happy run-in with Jim Shapiro. There was also, this was the best thing, around the same time, I got this phone call from someone, no, I had an email from someone saying, would you be willing to be interviewed on camera to discuss the stage history of Macbeth in America? And I wrote back and said, oh, that's very nice. And they said, it's for a documentary. And I wrote back and said, that's very nice of you, but I'm not really a theater historian and I don't really work on Macbeth. And, I can't really, and I don't really work on America. So, here are some names. And they wrote back and said, well, actually, we really wanted you. And did I mention that you'll be interviewed by Ethan Hawke? And so then, of course, being me, I just wrote right back and said, oh, yeah, I just remembered that I know a lot about the stage history of Macbeth in America. And I just remembered that I'm an expert on performance history. And I just remembered that there's a library down the street and I'm free any day in the coming 3 years. And so because it just sounded so fun, and because I am a little bit reckless about things like that, I just went to the library and got a lot of books and was like,
How did
okay,
it go with how did it go
this
with Ethan Hawke?
was great. My story, and I'm not having any truck with anyone who tries to debate this. My story is that he fell in love with me. I have a great picture of me with Ethan Hawke's arm around me. He looks very much in love. He at one point put his hand on my leg and gazed deeply into my eyes. And I thought, yep, that's it. And afterwards, and this is the clincher, this is my story, and I'm staying with it. Afterwards, he said, we'd been talking about, we had kids, similar age, going to school at Brooklyn, this and that. And afterwards, he said, so do you have to rush back to Brooklyn to get your kids? And I wanted to say, what I felt he was saying was, let me take you out. What I wanted to say was, actually, no, I have a babysitter, and what I am is starving because these people promised me lunch and there was no lunch. But what I said, because I'm a very good and responsible person, was, well, actually, they've asked me to stay on after the shoot to shoot some other scenes. But in my heart, what I believe is that Ethan Hawke asked me out and I turned him down. So, and I'm a happily married woman, and of course I would have turned down the movie star. But so I would say it was a smash success. Now, if you ask Ethan Hawke, he might have a different story, but that's okay. This was a while ago, I should say. I don't want to cast any aspersions on him at the moment, but
Well, you're our guest, and I'm on your side.
thank you.
I'm going to stick with
I appreciate
your
that.
story. It's your story. I'm
I
sticking with it.
thank you. It's a good story, and I feel there's no harm in my enjoying this story. That's
Oh,
my
that's a
general
wonderful
feel.
story. Well, the Red Bull, for people who in our international audience, just a quick, what is the Red Bull? Of course, it is sort of reconstructive, or at least the idea of reconstruction is there in the title, in the name of the theater. Uh,
Yeah, they don't aim for original practices, but Jesse's idea in naming it the Red Bull is to think about popular theater, to think about the gore, the guts, the comedy, to think about going beyond Shakespeare and looking at crowd pleasers from the period, and then looking just more broadly at what's happening in the period. So he stages Marston, Webster, Jonson, Marlowe, people who don't often get staged, Beaumont, Fletcher. Um, and it's a real pleasure. And every production is different. They do a lot of staged readings, and I love the staged readings because the emphasis is really on the language and it's not cluttered or diluted by thinking about um, other factors. And they just have a really spectacular group of actors. And it's not officially a repertory theater, but there's certainly a circle of New York-based classical actors who recur and revisit, whose careers I follow now with awe and delight. And so there is a little bit of that feeling of like, oh, okay, yeah, this is a role for such and such. Yeah, this is a role for such and such. And I have loved seeing those actors' relationships with the play develop over time too. That is a real pleasure.
That's wonderful. And these are professional productions using actors who are doing this professionally. Uh,
These are equity actors,
yeah.
yeah.
Do you have any? I know that Jim Shapiro is involved with the Shakespeare in the Park group. Do you work with any of those people at all?
I have never been involved with Shakespeare in the Park, but I have been involved with the Public Theater, which is the sponsor of Shakespeare in the Park. So I have done other events with the public, talkbacks, conversations with actors. I gave a talk there on the Greek tragic women book. I did a night called, I think it was called What's Hecuba to Him, in which I talked about Greek tragic actors and Elizabethan actors, and with a fabulous group of women, Felicia Rashad, who played Hecuba, a lot of other younger female actors. So I did an evening at the public with wonderful actors on that. I did an evening at the public on Anger and King Lear with actors who have performed King Lear at the public, including James Earl Jones, Sam Waterston. It was Murray Abraham. It was an amazing, I mean, it was really a spectacular group of actors. So I'm not involved with Shakespeare in the Park, but I do work with the public on other projects.
Uh, I just think, well, I think a lot of us are a little bit jealous because, if you don't live in London, in the English speaking dramatic scene, if you're not in London, if you're not in New York, you're not quite there. And I'm also thrilled by the fact that you are just right there with all of this theater activity, and these people are maintaining this. This is not easy to do to maintain a theater in any,
It's not easy.
even a major Broadway theater. It's very, very difficult, and to find out that there's enough, that you get enough audience participation, people coming to John Ford play. I find that uh, wonderful that would happen. That's when you know it's a good you have a good audience base, because you can pull people in with the name Shakespeare, but it has to be people who also will come to see a Ford play, right?
I agree. And Jesse has done a wonderful job of building an audience, building a community, building people who say, oh, the Red Bull's doing a reading, I'll go, whether we know anything about the reading or not. And there are things that I'll go to see because I know the actors. Even if I don't know the play, I just think, okay, for these actors, I'll cross town for that. And I have been very lucky. And I will say it was another happy accident that I ended up in New York. My first job out of grad school was at a place called McAllister College in Minnesota, and it was a great place to teach. Much more wealthy than CUNY, very lovely setup, great colleagues. But I was at the time seeing someone who was finishing a PhD in England, and there was not a job for him in Minnesota. And when he moved to the US and we got married, he got a job offer in New York City. And I was like, all right, that's it. I'm going to New York, and there's got to be something for me to do there. And I really moved to New York without a plan, just thinking, okay, there has to be. I applied that first year to every job within kind of a 5 hour driving distance of New York. I was like, there's got to be something closer than Minnesota. I want to live with this person. I want to have children and live in the same house. I am not looking at a commuting arrangement. And so I just kept applying. And once again, kind of like throwing myself at things. Eventually I got a job in New Jersey the first year, and that was manageable. It was a long commute, but it was manageable. But then when this job at Brooklyn College came up, I thought, if I got that job, I could bike to work across the park rather than take 2 hours on subway and New Jersey Transit. And luckily that worked out. But I wouldn't have been here in the first place if it wasn't for my husband's job, because I wouldn't have had a reason to leave a perfectly good job. So yeah, it's all been a lot of happy accidents. And I'm very grateful for them.
Well, it's a wonderful thing that the Brooklyn College job opened up. I know that CUNY is really famous for being the place for bootstrappers. There's a number of alumni are extraordinarily loyal to the institution because that's how they got their chance to attend college. They may be first generation. They
Yes.
may not have had the resources to travel somewhere to go off to college. And there it was. And it's just filled with fabulous faculty. There's an emphasis on teaching, but also on research. And you're in this fabulous city where, where you can do things. But uh, I think it's just a wonderful thing for you that worked out that
Thank
way.
you. I
Uh,
do feel very lucky. It is a hard place to teach, but it's really rewarding. And yes, most of my students are first generation college students. Most of my students speak a language other than English at home. Most of my students um, just really, sign up for classes thinking I need to get this college degree so that I can go forth in life. And then they discover things, and there's a lot of openness among them. Um, there's a they don't have a preconception of the rules or of the expectations. They're figuring things out. And I think that's very liberating. I like that. And I would say I don't see my colleagues a lot because it's a commuter school. We all live in different places. We're there on different days. But I have very, very committed colleagues. When I interviewed for the job, the woman who was the chair and became my chair said, "You'll find that we're all very evangelical about our teaching. And if you come here, you will be too." And it's true. You can't really teach CUNY students without it becoming kind of a mission. So that's satisfying. It's nice to have colleagues who are on the same mission as you, I think.
Yeah, I ended up here. Our students are very, very good, but I didn't start here, and I taught in places where most of my students, if not almost all of them, were first generation, and the challenges there. Sometimes I miss that.
Mhm.
People can they my students now can be kind of casual and get by with it. And back then, now I can't remember a class where there wasn't at least one, and usually more, student who I thought this person could go anywhere, right? They are bright, and this is good enough here. We're going to get them through, and you just they're if you look at the ones who really succeed, who really get it done, uh, you go, this is all worth it. It's all worth it. If and what a great okay, I'll get kind of flaky. A blessing. It's a blessing to
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
a this as part of our higher education system where we it's inclusive and what a wonderful thing. Now, I didn't want to let you go before we talked about your aerial work, and we're gonna find a way to connect this to Shakespeare or something. But
Okay.
the Tanya who does what you do is also the Tanya who uh, goes up into the air. So explain how that came up in your life.
So thank you for asking that. I am just head over heels in love with aerial silks practice. It started because I did a lot of yoga, like all women who live in Brooklyn, in this century. And a friend of mine read an article about a place in Manhattan where they taught something called aerial yoga on hammocks. And she said, "Let's try it." And I said, "Sure, let's go." And we went and we both fell in love with it. But then I would see the more, that was aerial yoga, which is very different. Then I was, we were hanging around more, taking other classes, and I would see people performing on the silks, which are really different than the hammocks. And I would just stare and think, that, I want that. And my friend was like, "No, absolutely not." And so we ended up, she's still my friend, but we ended up parting ways when it came to the circus work. I ended up, first I took classes on the lyra, which is the aerial hoop. Then I, for a long time, was taking doubles trapeze, not the flying trapeze, but doubles static trapeze, which means with someone lifting and swinging. And this was completely thrilling. And then when I found my way to the silks, I was like, that's it. The silks are what I love the most. So I still dream about a day when maybe I quit my day job and get the call from Cirque du Soleil. I'm not sure that's happening. I'm not sure I want to give up my health benefits and pension quite yet, but
Well,
I
just
love
just
it.
so our listeners know, this is you walking on a stage, and there are basically two silk, just cloths hanging down, and
Mhm.
you grab onto them and pull yourself up, and somehow manipulate your feet onto the cloth and go all the way up. Let's say, what, 20 feet, or is it
It
20?
depends on the room. There are places where it's 15 feet, there are places where it's 20, there are places where it's 30. It depends on the ceiling height of where you
So
are.
seven or 8 meters for a metric crowd,
Mhm.
and you go all the way to the top, and then you spin around and you do all of this stuff that is just it takes the breath out of anybody watching, uh, because well, it's beautiful, but it's also scary, and so uh, the. And you make it look easy. I think that's the great challenge. It's obviously hard to pull yourself up, right? Because at one point you need physical strength
Mhm.
and coordination and so forth. But now these performances that you have on your website, uh, what about the venues there? Who are these people who watch? What's going on there?
So the first time I decided to do a performance, I signed up for a performance creating workshop at a place called Ohm Factory and did one performance in their space, which is a kind of warehousey space in the Flatiron district. But then they said, we're thinking of renting the Slipper Room for a night. And the Slipper Room is a proper Manhattan downtown club, where there are burlesque shows. And I was like, excellent. In my 50s, I'm going to make my stage debut on a burlesque club. And where I was introduced by a very, very glamorous drag queen who was just so gorgeous and in a long black gown and amazing heels. I just coveted those heels. So the Slipper Room was a pretty spectacular experience. And then I signed up for another act creation workshop at a place called Aerial Arts, and that's another of these warehousey spaces, and that's in the Garment District. It's on 30th between 6 and 7. So I did one show in their space, but then I also performed at a place called Streb, which is in Williamsburg, and they do a lot of trapeze and other performances, and they have amazingly high ceilings. So yeah, I'll take them where I can get them, basically. And I am going to take you up on your offer to make a Shakespeare tie-in here. I want to give a little shout out. Claire McManus, who is a spectacular scholar, is doing work on early modern female acrobatic performances. And there is something called rope dancing. And Claire is doing really brilliant work. And I've told her that after she does her book, and I do the current book I'm doing, I want to collaborate with her on a project on women in the air from early modern to me. That that is my informal working title. No,
Mhm.
I don't know if this will actually happen, but I am fascinated because it turns out that actually in the early modern period, women, although female performers were not typically the majority of performers in acrobatics, female performers had an edge because women tend often to be lighter. And so there were often women from the continent or women who were on sideshows. So, in fact, there is a really fascinating history of female acrobatic performance and female aerial performance. And I like the idea that maybe I can be a little bit of a part of that. So, even though my own work with performance history, I'm very much the scholar turning to actors and directors as the creative authority. I think, well, now I have a little performance realm of my own, and I like that. So
Yeah.
there's a Shakespeare tie-in, especially because I'm interested in gender and performance and women in performance. I think now I'm actually friends with a lot of performers. A lot of the people I know from the aerial world are dancers or actors or other kinds of performers. And so I get to hear a little bit more about the world they inhabit, and I find that also kind of great.
Yeah, well, if we can, if we succeed in getting some more funding, I would love to have Claire on, and if you guys collaborated, we could have both of you on
That
to
sounds
talk
great.
about it, the pre-publication, post-publication, whatever's in the future.
You
I,
should definitely have Claire on. I should say I have not actually done any work in this. This is me just making it up, but
well,
Claire's work
yeah,
is amazing.
we need to make it rain a little bit to continue. But now
Yeah.
I talked with Tiffany Stern about this not that long ago, and she's done work on fairgrounds,
Yes.
and our idea of the classical theater as being separate from the county fair, right?
Mhm.
That she's showing how there was an enormous amount that people use the same space, and
Yes.
she's far better on it than I am. But uh, whatever, all types of public performance, like you do with your
Yeah.
aerial show, all of it, I don't think they would have seen it in the generic ways that we see it. That theater's over here and the circus is over there and the fair is over there. I think that these people knew each other and
I
often
think so.
collaborated on what they did. So you see, there you are. It's part of it's research. So your aerial work is research, and it's good for your health if you don't fall.
Yeah, and I've been wondering about that. If this is research, does that make it all tax deductible, which would be
Mhm.
excellent because I'm
Mhm.
afraid I spend a lot of my disposable income on aerial classes. So I think, yeah, it has a research element. And I absolutely agree with you. And I love Tiffany's work. And I think it's right that performers are a kind of mobile population who sort of segue back and forth between different media quite seamlessly. One of my friends from one of my aerial classes is new to New York and been auditioning for plays and got an audition and a callback for Hamilton, which is to say that there is real crossover between aerialists and the main stage in New York. And one of these days I'm going to be going out and seeing my aerial. In fact, my husband and I once we went to an opera in a big warehousey place in Bushwick, and there was an aerialist performing, and I was like, "Oh, I know her from my trapeze class." And sure enough, when she came down, we got to chat. So, in fact, I do sometimes find that the people who are performing in plays also overlap with my own world.
Well, yeah, it makes sense. I'm sure somebody has done something like this with Ariel and the Tempest. If you had an actor who could do something, I bet somebody has done something already, maybe with
Catherine
wires or something.
Hunter
Hmm?
at Julie Taymor's Midsummer Night's Dream at Theater for New Audience. Catherine Hunter played Puck, and she came down on aerial silks. Catherine Hunter is an astonishingly athletic actor. She does a lot of yoga. She is astonishingly strong and flexible, but she performed on the silks in that Midsummer. That was the first production at Theater for New Audience's new theater, which they built and own here in Brooklyn in Fort Greene. And it was really a stunning debut. And yes, so
Yeah.
that certainly happens right here in Shakespeare. So there we go. There's a conjunction right there. I told
Wow.
Jeffrey Horowitz, the theater's director, that I want him to bring me in on the silks. He's still thinking about that. He said maybe for one of the gala events when they bring the trustees together at the end of the year, he'll have me come down from the ceiling on silks and pour them all champagne. I think that would be good. I'm
Ooh,
I'm
that
gonna
would be, yeah.
I'm gonna push him on that.
But how do you do that? You have to go up there first and then they open the curtain. Is that it? Or because you start at
He
the
will
top?
figure it out. We
You-
haven't gotten that far. He
okay.
has to, yeah. But I show him my videos and he's like, we have to do this. We have to make this work. So yeah, watch this space. We'll see. I'll let you know if we figure out a way to bring me in on Ariel at Tofana. That would be a good crossover of my skills.
Good, good. Well, I've kept you past your supper time. Uh, if you have anything else you'd like to share, then please go ahead now. If not, I'd like you to stay a little bit after we finish our
Sure.
talk to debrief. And if not, I can't thank you enough for talking with us. It's just been lovely. And is there anything?
I don't think so. I think I'll probably think of something later in the night, but no, it was just such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
It's our pleasure, Tanya, and my best to you and yours there in Brooklyn.